those of you who are here this evening are all a part of the General Society family, whether you are our General Society membership, our faculty, our students, and our supporters. So I want to welcome you this evening. And we're especially happy to have the students from our HVAC and plumbing classes here, so we especially welcome you tonight. Tonight the program is The Lost Art of Steam Heating, and I am so happy to say that Mr. Dan Holohan is with us. And before I launch into his bio, I just want to say that I had the great good fortune of doing a 2-hour walkthrough with Dan a couple of Fridays ago, and he gave his heart and soul to the walkthrough and his interest, and really helped us to learn more about our STEAM system and make intelligent choices. So we're very grateful for what he gave us that day. And Dan Holohan began his love affair with heating systems in 1970, going to work for a New York-based manufacturer's representative that was deeply involved in the steam and hot water heating business. He studied hard, prowled many basements and attics with seasoned old-timers, and paid close attention to what they had to say. Today, Dan operates the popular website heatinghelp.com. He has written hundreds of columns for Plumbing and Mechanical, PM Engineer, Supply House Times, Oil Heating, Fuel Oil News, Old House Journal, Contractor, and Canada's HPAC. He's written 15 books on subjects ranging from steam and hot water heating to teaching technicians. From Maine to Hawaii and Florida to Alaska, Dan has taught over 200,000 people at his seminars. He is well known throughout the heating industry for his entertaining, anecdotal style of speaking. I am delighted we have an opportunity to hear Dan speak this evening. Thank you.
This is my bucket list place. I never in my life ever thought that I would get to be here and look around, let alone speak to you people. It's the Mechanics Institute piece. You know, I'm so excited. And New York, I was born in New York and raised here, and now live on Long Island, and I love this city, and I fell in love with the buildings and the steam and the dead men, the people that put this stuff in. And to me, it's all history and whimsy and just beauty. You know, the beauty of the simple things, the Delacorte clock that sits there and is magical in whatever age, and even more magical because it sits right next to this building, which has been there since before Central Park. And I got to look at this building last year and walk through it as we did, because I did some seminar for the Parks Department, and they asked me if I would take a look at some of their buildings, and I said, which one? They said, the Arsenal, and I said, oh my God. Because the Arsenal was there to store weapons for 2 years, and then the city decided that they were going to put a park there, so they took the Arsenal and they turned it into a police precinct for just a little bit of time, and then they turned it into the original Museum of Natural History while they were building the real one. And then they turned it into a menagerie for P.T. Barnum's animals. And then they turned it into an art museum. And then they turned it into the Weather Bureau. And then they turned it into the headquarters for the Parks Department, where Robert Moses did so much of his work until they moved to the Triborough Bridge, Randall's Island. And the building is there, and it's running off of Con Ed steam on a special type of system that there's only one of two systems that the Parks Department has that does run on Con Ed steam. And they bring in high pressure steam just as they do here, another iconic building. And they drop the pressure and off it goes. And I'm walking around this building and they're running like 8 or 9 pounds per square inch. And everybody is miserable, and they're fighting with each other, and they've got windows open, and this shouldn't be happening, 8 or 9 pounds of pressure. The Empire State Building on the coldest day of the year runs on 1.5 pounds of pressure. And here we got the Arsenal running on 8 pounds of pressure. So we go in and we start being nosy, and we always begin at where the steam comes into the building, and there's this pressure reducing valve, and the building is 2-pipe steam, and they had put thermostatic radiator valves, the non-electric type, on every radiator. So we've got this a setup that's like this. So we've got a main moving through and thermostatic radiator valves where the X's are, steam traps on the other side, and down at the end of the main there are floating thermostatic traps. Steam traps trap steam. If you're new to this and you want to know what the thing does, just turn the name around, it tells you what it does. Steam traps, air vents, condensate pumps, even in plumbing, P-traps. They do. They do. So it just turn the name around and you got it. So you start out and you ask yourself with steam, if I were air, could I get out? Because air is of a density that is not as light as steam. So these two things won't join. One will push the other down the pipe. So the steam pushes the air down the pipe like a plunger, and the air needs a way out. So when I begin, I always start wherever the steam comes in. It's knowing that this thing starts out completely filled with air and breathes like we do. On every cycle, the air comes out of the air vents and back in through the air vents as the steam condenses, because when water turns to steam, it expands 1,700 times. So one bottle of water becomes 1,700 bottles of steam. That's why we don't need pumps. That's one of the advantages of it. You save a lot of energy by not having to pump this stuff. So it pushes the air ahead of itself. So I want to know, where's it going to go? So we walk through this building, and we're nosy. So we're going down into people's offices and climbing up into drop ceilings and looking with an open mind and a bright flashlight. At one point, we went into the boardroom, and there on the wall, almost the length of that bookshelf, is the original drawing of what Central Park will be by Frederick Law Olmsted, and I walked over and hugged it. You would have done that too. And that's the best thing about being a heating guy, because we get to go places that most people don't get to go, like here. Huh? So we're in there, and I'm saying, if I were air, could I get out? And I know that the steam is pushing the air ahead of itself, and it's supposed to go through the traps and into the returns, and through this trap and into the returns. So we wander down the end, and I see those traps that are supposed to be there, and then I'm looking for air vents. So I turn around, and I wander the other way, all the way down to the end of the building, and at the other end of the building, there are other traps. So you've got traps here and traps here. Now, when you double trap a line like that, there's no difference in pressure between the two traps to move the water, so the pipe fills up with water. And water won't, air won't vent through water. This is why P-traps work, getting back to that, right? So they effectively stopped the whole building from heating, and the response then was, well, if we don't have any heat, let's raise the pressure. It's a knee-jerk reaction. The urge to raise the pressure is greater than the sex drive in most people that are in this industry, right? So if it's not heating, raise the pressure. And all you're doing then is compressing the air. So the steam appears to move further because you're compressing the air. You'll feel the pipe was hot to here, you raise the pressure, now it's hot to over there. You think you did something good, so you go back and you do it again. And pretty soon you're running ridiculously high pressure, and you can move with a pinhole what you can't move with a ton of pressure. So I said to the guys, these traps don't belong here. But the thing was, they had been there for a long time, and they were all painted, and they look good. They look real commercial and industrial. You know, there they are. And the guy says, those have always been here. I said, well, it's kind of like Uncle Fred, you know. He's over there in the lazy boy. He's useless, but he's always been there. And so I said, you got to get rid of those traps. So they believed me, and they took the traps out, and then they called me right afterwards, and they said, now, instead of taking 4 hours to heat the place, it heats in about 8 minutes, and it heats on extraordinarily low pressure. And I said, if you were air, could you get out? Huh? It's as simple as that. It's these basic principles you learn when you were a kid, right? There's a point where you know that if you hold your finger over the end of the straw and lift it out, the water's going to stay in the straw, the soda's going to stay in the straw, right? Why? Because it's the weight of the water trying to fall out versus the atmospheric pressure holding it in. So it's these forces of nature. Water flows downhill, heat goes toward cold. Heat doesn't rise, hot air rises, hot water rises. All these things that you know instinctively. You know everything you need to know. You just don't know that you know it. Sometimes you just need somebody to remind you, or sometimes you just have to stop, back up, and remind yourself, right? So you always begin by asking these basic questions about all this stuff, and it's not that complicated. We go on these old jobs and we see these gauges that measure in both pressure and vacuum. It goes from 0 to 15 pounds of pressure because that's the limit of a low-pressure steam boiler, and then it goes down to 30 inches of vacuum. And that's because when they were burning coal before we had oil and before we had gas, they had a problem. Toward the end of the day, the coal pile would burn down, and you didn't have as much energy going into the water to make coal. It's kind of like before we had gas barbecues and we had these Kingsford briquettes. Remember that? The old school barbecue, and you have a barbecue, and then Uncle Fred shows up late. And you're back there, and you're trying to make him a burger, and you're out waving the newspaper trying to get some more energy out of these coals to cook the damn burger. So that was the problem that the old-timers, the dead men, had with these systems where the coal pile would burn down. So they came up with this method of driving the system into a vacuum. Let's make a little bit of pressure, less than a pound of pressure, and we'll push the air out of the system, and on every air vent, there will be a check valve built into the air vent. So the air will go out, and when the steam condenses and shrinks to 1/1700th its volume, the air won't be able to get back in. So the system then will go into a deep vacuum, and you'll be able now to boil water at temperatures below atmospheric pressure. So you'd be sending steam up into the building at temperatures, in some cases, as low as 150 degrees steam going up into the building, and that was a pretty sweet way of heating. But then when they hook over to an automatic fuel such as oil or gas, and you now have a thermostat, as soon as the thermostat clicks, the fire is out, and there's no more heat to speak of in that boiler. So the vacuum forms way too fast. And now everything gets screwed up, right? So that was called vapor vacuum heating. And that was what was once in this building in a different version. The vacuum system, whether you use a big pump to produce vacuum, that comes up years later. And this gives the people that are building the building the advantage of downsizing every pipe, valve, and fitting in the building by at least one size. Empire State Building is a vacuum system. So if you want to save money on the go-in, you size it for a vacuum pump that's going to pull the air out of the system and create a negative pressure on the return side so that the condensate comes back faster and the air comes out of the system faster. But it also means that once it's a vacuum system, it's always a vacuum system. There's no going back. The problem is it depends on these steam traps on the radiators and at the ends of the mains to be working, because if steam traps don't trap steam, that really, really hot stuff comes back into the vacuum pump, which is in a vacuum, and it blows up the motor. So steam traps, when they fail on the radiators, they typically fail in the open position because that's the position that will cause you the most grief. And when it does that, the steam creeps into the returns and makes the condensate hotter and hotter and hotter. And this is never reported. It's not like it's not in the daily news. It's not in an obituary. The trap doesn't clutch its chest and scream and fall down. You don't notice it. It just fails. So things begin to fail, and now we're faced with a situation of doing this major renovation on all the steam traps in the building. And typically in New York, nobody wants to pay for that, or if it's a co-op building, or if it's any kind of government building, well, we can't inconvenience people. They won't let us into the apartment. So somebody comes along and says, why don't we just put one big trap right here at the end of the main, right before the pump? Seems like a great idea, right? It's like put the trap at the trunk of the tree to protect the pump. And when I see that, I always ask what I call the dead men question, which is, if that could be done, don't you think they would have done it? Were these people so stupid that they put traps on all the radiators because they had extra traps and time on their hands? No, they're out there for a reason. They're like the balancing valves in a hot water heating system. That's what steam traps do. They create points of pressure and no pressure. So once we put this big trap right here, the vacuum pump now pulls a vacuum from here to that trap, which then opens and vomits super hot water into the pump and blows it up all over again. Plus, you're now double trapping the line here, because if any traps in the building are still working, you just created what they had at the arsenal. So the water backs up in the line, you get water hammer, you get uneven heating, you get no heat, and you get some knucklehead raising the pressure. You don't even have to be that good to get this stuff right. All you have to do is think about basic things and maybe read a little. Sound good? By the way, I got to say, you're a very good-looking group. Thank you for taking care of yourself, because I'm looking at all of you. You're a great-looking group. Because last week I talked to a group that was just butt ugly, and it was really difficult. It's the speaker's burden, so thank you for taking care of yourself. So along Fifth Avenue, when the people when the people that could afford it built these mansions along there, Con Ed, well, prior to Con Ed, New York Steam Company actually set up a boiler plant just for them. So they had their own boiler plant. The Arsenal is tapped into that same line to this day. And in 1888, when that major blizzard came through, they were the only people in the city that continued to have heat. So that made district heating very popular, and that's part of what makes this building, what you see now that this is on district heating, because Con Ed, they said, this is one of the pluses. You don't have to depend on people trying to deliver fuel to you if everything's coming to you underground. 973 Fifth Avenue is a house that I looked at a couple of years ago, and it was a fascinating place because it had just sold, I think, for $40 million, and there were 2 people and a kid moving into it. And they were going to put in, new HVAC split system, but they wanted to know if it was viable to keep the Con Ed steam. So I went there to look at it, mostly because I'm nosy, and look at it. So I went in there and I'm wandering around, and what they had there was indirect heating. So this is from a time when they would bring in 100% fresh air from the outside, and it would waft over what are essentially boiler sections that hang suspended in ductwork, and then come up through the floor grates that were placed all over the place. So inside, you've got this type of a setup inside the ductwork, and it's coming up through grates in the floor that look very decorative like that, or in the walls. And in most of these older buildings, they had no return air duct going back. It was the leakage of the building that made it work. So they'd bring in cold air from outside, heat it up, send it up into the building, and then it would just leak out. And the comedy of that is when you get a super rich person that decides to bring in a blower door test and button up the house and weatherize it and make it real tight. Now suddenly he has no heat at all. I love that. That's when you could charge a fortune to punch holes in his walls. And but these people on Fifth Avenue, they actually had a return air duct, and it was the most fascinating one I've ever seen in my life because it was that stairway. So this went up 7 stories inside the house, and the heat is coming up out of the ground on each floor through those beautiful grates, the bronze grates. And the air would very gently just fall back down the center of that stairway. And at the bottom of that stairway, there was this door that was very decorative. And when you opened the door, there was nothing in there except a big return air duct that went right back down to the basement, all working off Con Ed. So the thing is, if you know what it is that you're looking at, you could become a very valuable person, right? And if I could do this, anybody could do this. Believe me. You know what I did? You know how I learned this? I went to the library on 42nd Street. There's a big library there. They got a lot of books in there. So you just got to read a little bit every day. Stop texting. Get off the Facebook. Up in the servants' quarters in that house, they had these. So we've got thermostatic radiator valves that are just laying on the floor, and we've got steam traps over here. So that's where it's not fancy in that part of the building. And then we went up on the roof, and because I wanted to know, I wanted to know if this building had ever had a boiler in it. And we went up on the roof looking for a chimney, and there wasn't. So I'm looking over there, and I turn and I see across the park there was the Dakota, which is a really important building to me because that was built in 1884, and it was called the Dakota because the architects made fun of it. It was an apartment building built on the other side of Central Park, where we've got houses over here that I showed you earlier, mansions. And in 1884, it was absurd that anybody would live in an apartment building with other people. Who's going to do that? Nobody will ever do that. And look where they built it, for Pete's sakes. There's nothing up there. They might as well have built it in Dakota. So they decided to call it the Dakota. And who decided to call it the Dakota were the builders, Edward Clark and Isaac Merritt Singer. So here we've got when it first opens up. And I love this picture because everybody in this picture has something in common, that being that they're all dead. Right? But on that day, they were just filled with joy, and it was going to be a fabulous time, and life was going to be good for them. They had no idea that someday there was going to be a thing called rock and roll. They didn't know there was going to be a band called the Beatles that would come and play in 1965 at Shea Stadium. They didn't know that these little saplings over here would someday grow tall and be called strawberry fields. They didn't know any of that. But on the day that system is running, that heating system, that's the same heating system that's running right now. It's a landmark building. They don't get to change that. So that's the amazing part about New York, is that you can have a building like that filled with people that are so rich, it's scary, and they have to work with a heating system from 1884. These are the guys that built it. So Edward Clark finishes it. This is his partner. They were partners in the Singer sewing machine family. They were not good friends. Isaac Singer was a philanderer. He had 5 families all at the same time here in New York, and countless children that he didn't know. And when he died, all of that came out. And his widow, there was a famous battle. This is the stuff you find out when you're looking at old radiators. But his widow was Isabella Boyer Singer, and she was a considered to be one of the most beautiful women in the world at the time. Standards have somewhat changed, I think. But back in the day, she was a serious hottie. So she leaves with the Singer sewing machine fortune and moves back to France, because she's from France. And this is the best part of the story, because when she moves back to France, she's quite famous there. So famous, in fact, that Bartholdi decides to use her for the model of the Statue of Liberty. So when you look at the Statue of Liberty's face, that is Isabella Boyer Singer. And this is the stuff that you can find out by poking around old buildings, because the Dakota had this. It also had big funnels on the roof as wide as this table. And they collected rainwater and ran the elevators off the rainwater that they collected. They also produced steam with a steam engine, and they passed it to the buildings around them. So when other buildings were built, there were tunnels that still are there under the street, under 72nd Street, that go to these other buildings, because they were selling power and steam. So this is one of the first cogen plants in the world, the Dakota. Imagine this. The time goes by. These are the radiators that they have there. They're radiators that were made from surplus gun barrels left over after the Civil War. They're called Reed radiators. And each one of those old gun barrels is plugged at the top, and there's a tube that runs up the inside. And over here you can see the remnants of what was called a Paul system after Andrew Paul. This building has that same system. This building in the Dakota shared the same steam system. So we have a way of sucking the air out of the radiators, and it's going to come out through these little fittings that would be placed where an air vent would normally go. And these are made by a company called Pemberton. So this screws into the 1/8-inch connection for the radiator, and then each radiator has a tube that comes down and gathers together in great bundles, and they used an ejector in the basement. They run steam through an ejector to produce a vacuum. Bernoulli's law kicks in, they suck the air out of the radiators, and they improve the efficiency of the building by about 30%. None of that was in place anymore, but they did give me one of these when I went to visit, and I opened it up, and what was inside there was a cork. So the steam the air would be pushed by the cork. When the steam hit the cork, it would swell up a cork like you have in a wine bottle, and that would stop the steam from going down that tube. And isn't that cool? Isn't it fun? Right? So that's the top of the radiators that you see there, and this was all changed over in the Dakota to what's now called a two-pipe air vent system, which is what this building now has. Supply valve on both sides. The supply valve on the supply side is one size larger than the return. So this is a system where the steam is supposed to be in both the supply and the return. The worst thing you could do to this system is to put steam traps on it, which is what they talked about doing at some point. So the Dakota also employs 3 guys that sit in the basement all day long waiting for somebody to call down and say, it's a little chilly up here, can you come up? And they go up and they open those valves. And then they go down and wait. And then they say, now it's a little hot, can you come up? And they go up and they close those valves. These are 2-legged zone valves. Nice. Up and down all day long. It's good stuff. So there it is in 2005 when the gates were up. And today in 2015, 10 years later, it's still operating off the same steam system that was there when it was first built in 1884. If you know how that system works, you become a very, very valuable person. Why shouldn't you be the one with the answers? Why shouldn't you be? Stop texting. 85 Fifth Avenue has the same system, and it has 2-pipe steam up to that point, and then 1-pipe steam above that to the stories that they added. And it's very common to have steam that's 2-pipe and 1-pipe in the same building. And this was a building that was part of the Ladies' Mile back in the day. This area down in Fifth Avenue, down in the teens, was the place where the women went to shop, and all these buildings were stores. And when you go into it now, you've got the same 2-pipe air vent system. So it's a supply going up, a return going down, and the radiators are connected like the rungs on a ladder. And the steam favors the supply line because the pressure is a little bit lower there, but it moves through the radiators and into the return and then up toward the air vents. So the steam is rising up both lines toward the air vents, and that's normal. So this is the simplest of all systems. Why would anybody mess with that? That's what you have here. You don't want to start it's like trying to put rollerblades on an elephant, for Pete's sake. You don't want to modernize something that's that significantly simple. Just leave it as it is. In that building on Fifth Avenue, they decided that they were going to add thermostatic radiator valves. So here's the supply. You can see it's one size larger than the return. So two sides of the ladder, and here's the rung of the ladder. So the steam goes into the radiator. They put a thermostatic radiator valve on there. Steam goes over to the other side of the radiator. This is the return. There's the air vent. So the thermostatic radiator valve closes. The steam just shrugs and uses the return line to enter the radiator, fill it up with steam, and come out the air vent. So this is a law office, and they just paid to have all these thermostatic radiator valves put in. So I explained to them what was going on best I could. And they said, well, what has to be done? I said, well, you've got to get rid of these, and you have to replace them with the thermostatic radiator valve that goes between the air vent and the radiator, which looks like that. So this screws into where the air vent was. So in other words, instead of trying to control the steam going in, we're going to control the air going out. Because if the air can't get out, the steam can't get in. It's back to that same thing we had at the Arsenal, right? So we're going to do it like that. So the lawyer says to me, well, who's supposed to pay for this? I said, that's sociology. It's not engineering, that's sociology. That's between you and everybody else, right? And then they say, well, we didn't know. I said, well, that's tuition. That's tuition. Now you know. So same building, this thermostatic radiator valve with the remote sensor, they want to know why the radiator won't get hot. I said, take the remote sensor off the radiator. Here this was an old pneumatic system, and the pneumatics was air-operated system. They got rid of that. They replaced it with thermostatic radiator valves and put it right over the hot pipe. So the pipe gets hot, the radiator valve closes, no heat. See how almost always it's a simple thing? Almost always it's a simple thing. Here's one for you. Try to solve this. People on Long Island build an extension out the back of the house, and they run a steam pipe through the crawl space that's coming off the back stoop, and it goes through this uninsulated crawl space, and it comes up into this radiator about 20 feet away. And there's water squirting out of the air vent that's hitting the ceiling. So this is how a contractor solved the problem. Somebody actually paid a contractor for this. He gets a bottle of soda and puts it over the air vent, hooks a hose up to it, drills a hole in the floor, and goes down into the crawl space with the hose. So now let's go down the crawl space, see what's what. Okay, now we're in the crawl space. Here comes the hose, and we're going to secure it to a 2x4 with some twine, and then it's going to go that way. So let's turn around and look that way. So now we're looking the other way. Okay, there's the old stoop. You see, we're going to drill a hole through the stoop. There's the drill, and we're going to stick the hose down into the basement through the cement, and let's go down the basement. So now we're down the basement, and here it comes through the stoop, and we drop the hose into a slop sink, not wanting to waste any of that Sears Best hose. So we just and the guy got paid for this, isn't it? If you can't make a living in America, you're not paying attention. There's so many knuckleheads out there, and there's customers for them too. So they're waiting for you. So that's water hammer. That's what you get when you got steam moving at gale force wind across the surface of the water, and it picks it up, and the water can't get out of the way, so it gets picked up and it gets thrown toward the end, and it's going to hit with tremendous violence. So much so that when Con Ed has that experience, as they did here in 2007, this was caused by a contractor that was working within the system while it was under pressure, sealing something, and the sealant got loose, and it went into 2 steam traps. And it caused this explosion that killed one person and put stuff on the top of the Chrysler building. So that's the tremendous potential for water hammer, all caused because that morning there was a super big rain. And when this thing happened, I said to my wife, the rain did that, because the rain goes down into those holes, and it gets on the outside of the pipe. When you see those cones on those corners where you see the steam coming out, that's not a steam leak. That's rainwater on the outside of the pipes. That's what you're seeing coming out of those tubes with Con Ed. So this cost them, by the time it was settled, I think it was $40 million for 2 steam traps. So a lot to be said for preventative maintenance, right? Followed up by lawsuits. So water hammer will do that. Here's a radiator that was hammering like crazy. So you got to ask the question, will water flow uphill on a 1-pipe steam radiator if we're going to pipe it like that? Can water drain out of that radiator? Here's one in Brooklyn where they had such severe water hammer that the contractor decided to screw a hot water heating system, expansion tank, into the steam line to act as some sort of a shock absorber. Didn't work, but it was a great try. Wasn't that fabulous? So here's another one. We got this convector that's coming up, and it's going into steam pipes come out of the floor. It goes over here. There's the air vent. It comes back over here. There's a check valve, and it goes right back into the same pipe. What do you think of that? Now, you're laughing, but this is actually brilliant. And by the way, when you see something like this and you realize that it's been there for 50 years or 60 years or 70 years and it's working, you're less likely to laugh. Because when we do face a situation like this, like the guy with the squirting air vent with the pop bottle over the top, that's how we deal with it. We come off the main and we pitch the radiator this way and we vent it and we then drain into a wet return. And if there's no wet return available, we go up and come back and we build what's called a water seal, which is just a pipe that goes down to the floor and comes back up. It fills with water, steam won't go through it. And if we were in a tall building and we want to do the same thing, we tap off the vertical riser and we go into the radiator and we pitch in the direction of flow and we come back and we give ourselves just a little bit of height here and a check valve and we go right back into the same riser. So the steam goes this way, the steam keeps the check valve closed. Steam pushes through the toward the air vent. There's always going to be some leftover pressure on this side that combines with the weight of the water in this vertical pipe to open the check valve, and the condensate slides right back down the main. That's what they're doing here. See that? So it comes up here, pitches this way, comes down. The height of the water here combines with the steam pressure that's there to open that check valve to send it right down. So, still laughing? What did you just learn? All right? When you see something that's old and it's been there for a long time and it's working, don't laugh at it. Marvel at it. I laughed at it. Madonna lived in this building. She had a system that was done by a man named John Mills, and this was John Mills was dead, in the 19th century, but John Mills gave us a lot of things, and one of them was the Mills system, and Madonna's building had screwed pipes. So there were air vents at the top and air vents on the radiators, and I was up here in a crawl space with a friend, and this was a 12 by 12 by 3/4 inch screwed T. Now, that's probably a 300-pound fitting. It's bigger than your imagination. But when you see something like that, it's marvelous to think, like, who did this? Like, who put this here? Who were these guys that were able to do this sort of work? So when we look at something like that, we have to consider all the ways water's getting back into the boiler. In a gravity return system such as we have here, we've got say, out here, the distance between the lowest horizontal steam pipe and the boiler water line has to be at least 28 inches, which is equal to a pound of water weight. And that's because if we start out with, say, 2 pounds of pressure in the boiler, we're going to lose energy as we go around, so we might only have, say, 1.5 pounds of pressure left over in a really big building. So on one side of the scale, we've got 2 pounds, and on the other side of the scale, we've got 1.5 pounds, so the water's going to back out of the boiler and go up this line. So we allow a space at 28 inches, so that equals a pound. So 1.5 pounds of leftover steam combines with a pound of water weight to put the water back in the boiler. It's called gravity return. This gets gloriously screwed up on jobs as soon as they add motorized valves. See, because you put a motorized valve in there, the motorized valves start to close. Now we need a condensate pump, because otherwise everything's going to back out of the boiler when the motorized valves close. And as soon as you put a condensate pump in here, when the motorized valves close, you get a deep vacuum in this piping above the boiler water line and this piping here. And you stand there and you watch the water in the gauge glass just zoom right up as the vacuum forms, because the atmospheric pressure here just pushes the water out of the pump and into the boiler. And again, it's all basic stuff that you knew when you were growing up and sticking straws in a bottle of milk and pulling it out and making it dribble all over the place. Nothing complicated here at all. 1918, we had an event called the Spanish influenza that changed heating once and for all. Because the Board of Health came out and it said, now we have to have our windows open. So 1919, 1920, I start to see books that talk about the fresh air movement. The heating engineering books said we have to design for the coldest day of the year with the wind blowing and the windows open. Right? So that changes everything. So we have this movement that just takes the world by storm. Here's, because Spanish influenza killed 50 million people, which is equal to the entire population of the northeast portion of the United States of America. 50 million people died from this thing. You probably never even heard of it. It was the worst disaster in the history of the world. Here's a guy that got shot by a cop because he refused to put on his influenza mask when he was outside. You weren't allowed out on the street without that mask. Cop shoots him. That's how serious this stuff was. 40,000 people in Manhattan died from this thing in that one winter. So then the Depression arrives, and now we're sizing heating systems for open window ventilation. The Depression shows up, and people are, they've got these oversized radiators that they're paying for coal, and they say, shut the window. what are you doing? So people start shutting the windows, and now these radiators are putting out more heat than Shakira. You know, you're in there and you can't even breathe. So they said, do something. So they start do stuff like this. They make these embroidered, essentially radiator condoms to slide over the radiator to pull up and down to stop the heat from coming off. And then they said to the government, do something. So the government steps in, and they discover that if you use this special kind of paint called bronzing, it has this effect of cutting the radiator's output by 20%. And it's a particular paint that contains metal flakes. And they published this. So they said, here, if we have a radiator that's cast iron and not painted, it's 100% effective. It's putting out 240 BTUs per square foot. And if we painted aluminum bronze, it cuts it down to 192. In other words, it takes 20% off. This is why radiators are silver. Next time you're out with somebody and you're looking at radiators, you're going around doing a survey, you tell them that story, you claim it as your own, they're going to think you're fascinating. Because don't you think I'm fascinating? Huh? If I could tell you something you didn't know, that's fascinating, right? Oh, by the way, look, and it's only the final coat, because if you go back and you paint it black, it goes back to 100%. Or if you paint it the color of a flower pot, terracotta, you actually pick up 3.8%. So color does matter. And if you go on our website, I left a card there, and you look in just search, does the color of a radiator matter? You're gonna find the National Bureau of Standards report from 1935 that explains the science behind all this. They also then decided they're going to put covers on the radiator, and it wasn't to keep the children from being burned. It was to cut down on the heat. If you put something as simple as a shelf over the top of this, this says you have to add 20% to the size of the radiator to get the same output that you would get if the shelf were not there. And this one has no change because there's holes in the bottom, solid in the middle, holes in the top, so you get that chimney effect. This is the one that I love because you've got some of these upstairs. This is that classic radiator cover that's got the hinged top and it's got that perforated front. And you see it advertised, and they'll say, you know, saves energy and all this. It does not save energy. It cuts 30% of the output. So it saves energy if the radiator is oversized by a lot because of open window ventilation. But that's, you see, it's the history, the sociology, the American history. All this stuff comes into play in the engineering that we're doing. You got to know these stories. Here, look at this. 1 square foot of equivalent direct radiation, which I explained, has this definition. It puts out 240 BTUs, but only under these conditions. When there's 70-degree air on the outside of the radiator, and this is what's key, when there's 215-degree steam on the inside. Now, why that's so important is because 215-degree steam happens to be steam at 1 psi pressure. So on the coldest day of the year with the windows open, we're expecting there to be no more than 1 pound of pressure inside that radiator. This is how the Empire State Building works on 1.5 pounds. Now, this was determined at the old Murray Hill Hotel right down the street at a meeting held by a group called the Carbon Club. Now, the Carbon Club was primarily the American Radiator Company that put together a group of people, and their purpose was to fix prices. And they were doing this when the Sherman Antitrust Act was already in effect for 10 years. So they were in tremendous violation of federal law. They didn't care. They were building an industry. So their purpose was to fix prices, and if a boiler company didn't join the Carbon Club, they were then ostracized, not only ostracized, but the members of the Carbon Club would find their customers and give them boilers for free. If you want to see the remnants of the American Radiator Company, go over to the Bryant Park Hotel, which is right around the corner here on 40th Street. It used to be the American Radiator Building, and it's made of black stone to look like coal, and if you look up, you'll see that gold leaf crenellated roof that's supposed to look like the glowing embers in a coal boiler. The lobby in the restaurant of the Bryant Park Hotel used to be a showroom for boilers and radiators. Can you imagine there was a time in America when you can display a boiler in that address? This is how important this was. So they got together, the Carbon Club, and they were trying to find a way to make the systems safer so that there weren't as many explosions as there were at that time. So on December 18th, they had a meeting, and they said, okay, today we're going to make a decision. We're going to say that from now on, every hot water system should operate on no more than 180 degrees. They just arbitrarily chose that. And then on December 19th, just before the end of the century, they said, from this day forward, we are going to establish what's called the 2 psi standard. Any building built from this day forward will work on 2 pounds of pressure or less. And if it doesn't, it's the contractor's fault, because we're going to give you pipe sizing charts that measure the pressure drop of steam as it travels through the pipe at 1 ounce of loss for every 100 feet of travel. So if we start out with 2 pounds of pressure, 1,600 feet down the line, or 160 stories straight up in the air, we're still going to have 1 pound of pressure, which will satisfy EDR. Get it? This is how the Empire State Building runs on that. So if you can't heat a building on 2 pounds of pressure or less, your problem is not the pressure. Your problem is air. So you got to, once again, go back to wherever the boiler is, wherever the pressure reducing valve is, like in this building, and you ask this key question: if I were air, could I get out? If you can't get out, the steam's not going to get in. Plus, you get to be nosy and you get to wander around. And that's the best part of all this, don't you think? Are you having a good time? Yes. So I've hit my 45-minute mark. Sure, absolutely. Prior to World War II, why did steamboilers fade away? Prior to World War II, 50% of all the buildings in America by the U.S. Census were heated hydronically. Hydronic is anything that uses water, so it includes steam and hot water. So before World War II, it's all steam and water except for the buildings that don't have central heat. So like my parents grew up in Manhattan, they didn't have heat until they were married. They had a stove, living on the Upper East Side. So we've either got fireplaces or stoves, and most of the country is heating hydronically. World War II happens, and during World War II, there is no heating industry. Everybody in the heating industry went into the production of something for the war, so you couldn't get any metal to make anything for the heating industry. We come out of the heating industry, and we're now in the 1950s, and in 1956, the Interstate Highway Act appears, thanks to President Eisenhower, and we suddenly begin to build roads out of our cities for the purpose of getting us away from nuclear war. But with this comes the suburbs, and a furnace will always be cheaper than a boiler. So it immediately shifts after World War II with the building of tract housing, and then comes air conditioning, which goes hand in hand with a furnace, even though for half the year your ducts are in the wrong place because hot air rises and cold air sinks. So now we got to put in powerful fans that are going to make people uncomfortable, but people at this point don't even realize that they were uncomfortable because this is their first heating system. It's kind of like having a wedgie. If you've got it every day because your underwear is too tight, you don't even realize it after a while until somebody comes along and pulls that out and say, here, isn't that better? Right? So that's the reason why. So when I came into this industry, hydronics was about 11% of the business, and that was 45 years ago, and it continues to be 11% of the business. So it's a very profitable non-growth business, and I suspect it'll stay like that. Yes?
Thank you, Meg. In the first instance, you demonstrated a great deal of issues with a number of these buildings,
Yes.
including the one on Fifth Avenue, et cetera, et cetera. I saw the Danfoss valves, et cetera, people trying to fix things.
Mm-hmm.
So is it because of lack of understanding of how the system works, or is the steam system not as reliable as other systems that are now in place?
I think it's the laying on of too many hands that don't know what they're doing. Like everybody's trying something and touching it, and that changes it even further. A few weeks ago, I spoke to the Association of Energy Engineers, and one of the fellows that was there was involved in the redoing of the Empire State Building, which is now LEED Gold. Wow. So the Empire State Building has a steam system, and he said to me, so many people had touched that, and he says, you know what we did? He says, I felt really good about this, because he says, we went back to your book, which is called The Lost Art of Steam Heating, and he says, let's put it back to the way it was in 1929. And he said, there's a space above the highest point where the tourists can go, not the main area, but you're right, another elevator. He says, there's a room up there, and public doesn't get to go up there. He says, there's a radiator in that room. He says, I stood in that radiator and called downstairs and told them to open the steam valve, and he says, the steam was at that radiator in seconds. He says, you are so right. It moves at the speed of sound. The only thing in its way is air. So if you bring things back to the way they were, You know, this is what we're trying to do here. Like, why do we have a boiler feed pump dumping water into a sewer when we could do that by gravity? There's a way, it's called a false water line. This building used to have a boiler, and all the pipes that are in the basement used to be underwater. Suddenly you've got Con Ed steam, and now you've got to put traps on those lines. Well, why not build a false water line, which is just it's an old piping trick. We take a big wide piece of pipe, we put steam into the top, we put water into the bottom, we pipe some steam traps into the side of this bottle, and we set it so that the water line inside the bottle is about this high, and that puts everything in this building back underwater. In other words, we match the bottle with wherever the water line of the boiler used to be. So no need for traps anymore down in the basement. And then you just spill out of the bottle and you go into a reservoir, and the water will cool naturally in the reservoir and then just flow by gravity. This is Alex's idea, right? And just flow into the sewer. So why not water seals instead of steam traps? They worked in 1890 and they're still working. If you go down to Lower Manhattan, those systems are still in place because there's no moving parts to them except the water.
Well, we really need to talk because I'm the chair of facilities for this building, so we'll talk offline. And you mentioned Con Edison, and the very little that I know about steam these days is that it is a byproduct of creating electricity. So my question, and perhaps it is a sociological one, is if it's a byproduct, why is Con Ed charging us?
Well, they still have to move it from there. They have to get it from there to here. Yeah, and there's a lot of science involved in that.
Is there really?
Yeah, there really is. But you know, when I met Victoria, when I came here a couple of weeks ago, I walked in here. We started to look around, and I said to her, "You know what? I have lived my whole life and studied to come to this building."
Well, thank you.
Right. And I mean that. This is,
Thank you.
and I didn't, you know,
Watch what you say because we won't leave you alone.
Well, I felt the same way when I walked into the Dakota. I felt the same way when I walked into the Empire State. You know, these are iconic buildings. I'm a New Yorker. So what I need everybody to understand is something like the Arsenal. I touched that building with my mind. And in touching that building and giving what I studied to these people to make it work, I touched not only that building, but everybody that was involved in that building from 1840, and everybody that will be involved in that building when I'm dead. I had a moment when I could touch that building and change people's lives and save energy. Yeah. And this is something that I need you to understand, because this is what keeps you going. Because if you go to work every day just changing pipes, you know, screwing things on, screwing things off, you're going to go nuts. You're going to get frustrated. You're going to leave the industry. But if you can see the beauty of this and the history of it and realize that you are a piece of something that is big and important and vital. You know, got time for a quick story?
Please.
I read. I don't do much other than read. I mean, that's what I do. And I read lists. I read, you know, I get in my head. I want to read everything that was written about this. So a couple of years ago, I said, I want to read every book that won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And it started in 1911, and it was up to today. So, and I said, I'm going to read them from the ends. I'm going to read the first book and the current book, and then I'm going to read the next two, I'm going to read the next two. And while I'm doing this, because the Pulitzer Prize has to be written by an American, and it has to be about American life. So in doing this, I'm going to find out some things about the way people lived. So I'm reading these books from the outside in, and in the earlier books, they are talking about the heating. They're talking about winter like it's a character. This is something that existed inside as well as outside. This is something that was going to come into your house and kill your children, and you had to protect against it. We don't even think about stuff like this anymore. Right. We think this is normal for this building to be 70 degrees on a day like this. This is not normal. This does not happen on its own. This is what we make happen. So in the earlier Pulitzer books, they are marveling at these things, and they get everything technically right. They're talking about building a fire. They're talking about making a boiler work in New York. They're talking about the magician that comes in here and is able to do this incredible thing called making it warm inside. The books on the other end, they're about angst and depression and sex and anxiety. And if they get anything right about if they write about the heating, it's a butt crack joke about the plumber, or they get it technically wrong, which makes me crazy, because isn't there anybody in the book business that's checking these authors? They're talking about pumping the steam. I want to strangle the guy. So I'm reading these, and I'm watching as we approach the middle, 1964, in the middle of the list. And somewhere along the line, we began to do what we do so well that we became invisible. Right? When you look at the hammer, and you talk about nothing happens until somebody picks up that tool. This is what you need to get. You need to realize that you are doing something that is essential to human life and essential to the life of this city. And if you can embrace that, your life will be filled with joy. So when I said to her, I was born to walk into this building, I meant it. And I gave it, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And you all have my card, and it's got my cell phone on it, so call me. Yeah. And I do this because I love you. You had me at hello. You complete me. You complete me. No texting. Well, no texting while walking. So, oh
Dan.
my God.
Is this on? Hello. Dan. Well, normally I just present the certificate, but I just want to say that I can't thank you enough for this truly magnificent presentation. We learned so much about your work, the art of steam heating, the passion you have about your work, and so many lessons to be learned tonight. And this is a really special night at the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen. So as much as you feel that you were born to come to this building, we feel, yes, and you were born to come here. So I'm going to do something I've never done. Let me explain something, please, to everyone. You know, we were founded 230 years ago by 22 tradesmen. Robert Boyd, our first president, who was a blacksmith, decided to gather people, tradesmen who represented every trade in New York City at the time, and there were 22, whether it be a carpenter, a blacksmith, saddler, tailor, to come to the Walter Ayers Tavern and form the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. Since then, 5 mayors, Andrew Carnegie, Abram S. Hewitt, and our contemporary members, it goes on, have signed the Register of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen. Now, I know I asked you this privately, but I have to ask you in front of everyone, in fact, invite you in front of our membership, our faculty, and our students and supporters to become a member of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen.
I'd be honored.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes.
She says, and be on the facilities committee.
And on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, we would like to express our gratitude for addressing the membership of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen and the Mechanics Institute students. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wow.
And I invite everyone for, there's a reception following, and Dan, you had us at hello, just so you know that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time. It's a great gift to me. Thank you.